Andrea Allen Hughes. I'm now Deputy Principal at North West Kent College, but I was Head Teacher at the secondary modern high school, and therefore I saw what the students' approach to maths was there coming through. And I agree totally with what you were saying about confidence, because what we had to do predominantly with girls, I must say, is give them coaching first in developing their confidence and then go to maths afterwards. But what we're finding at the college is that, as you say, they're already switched off. So we're having a moral debate at the moment. Is it better to have an embedded approach or a separate approach to maths being taught by itself?
So can you
integrated or...
Can you direct, I assume that's at Johnny Law?
To Johnny, yes.
But then I'll look to see if the other panel wants to do, because obviously we can't have everybody answering every question, so if you can tell you, so Johnny, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'm not in the education sector. I was around, I flit around the edges, and I've done all the time for many years. So I really find it difficult to hone in immediately on what is embedded and what is not embedded. You understand? I don't understand where the guidelines are drawn for teachers. I do know that Maria Montessori said, I mean, the idea of the curriculum, for instance, in where you teach the 5 times table one year and then say you can't learn 5 times 6 till next year, is the most preposterous thing I've ever heard. But apparently some schools actually go along with that because the curriculum seems to state it. And that's preposterous. You really can't teach anything within a strict framework. You get the child into a position where they want to know. When they want to know, you pour the information in until their eyes glaze over and take them anywhere. When I was 7, Hiroshima happened, and I came out of a cub hut with other cubs in the dark under a lamp in Bristol. And we drew in the trodden earth a diagram of the Bristol Channel and Bristol in concentric rings, putting us in our home 5 miles away. And we discussed, age 7, how long we would live if the atom bomb was dropped on Bristol. So the attitude of children is, or the desire to understand the children is only governed by what they don't know. And what they do know, they can paint pictures that are just as clear as any other adult. So to say you only teach at this level, you only teach at this time, is preposterous, and that's a big failing with public education.
Thank you, Johnny. I think Steve and then Geoff are going to comment.
Hi, Rhiannon. I personally would argue for it to be integrated. I did an apprenticeship as a brickie, and my view is that if you're teaching for craft students, a lot of them, if they lack that confidence in maths, if they're doing it in the context of the subject, they don't often know that they're even doing maths. And you can make it much more important if you're teaching hairdressing, if it's something about the business of running a salon. The difficulty we've got with that right now is that Ofsted is pushing us towards everybody who may have a D doing the GCSE. And my personal view is that for the majority of our students, it isn't actually the right choice for them. They're also revamping the GCSE at the moment. It's going to be much harder. Especially in the maths GCSE, it's almost close to being a double GCSE, but they're not going to allow it to be a double. I think we should hold our nerve on that, and we should put the kids in to do functional skills, and we should make it... Functional skills is much closer to what employers have asked for, but we're having a worry at the moment, and we're thinking that functional skills that we should be going towards GCSE. I think it should be embedded. I think it's slightly different for kids that are perhaps going to be progressing towards higher education, where the GCSE is going to make a difference to their career choices. But alongside that, I'd go for some of the enthusiasm that Johnny was talking about earlier to try and get into our teaching, because that's the only way we're going to deal with the funding cut, is we've got to do the equivalent of MOOCs, we've got to do some very different things around maths, but let's try and resist GCSE for everybody.
And they're going to be introducing VOOCs, aren't they? Vocational.
Right.
VOOCs, yes, our industry, the University for Industry is going to fund some developments in that. And I forgot to say that Stephen was actually a bricklaying student at Midkent College when he was first went to a college, didn't you know? That
I was, yeah.
So actually went through that route. Geoff, please.
I absolutely agree with the idea of embedding it. Professor John Hattie's looked at 800 factors that are supposed to affect students' attainment, and very, very few have a negative outcome. But one of them is what he calls retention, and that's what educationalists who do this research mean by retaking a year. And that's got an effect size of -0.7 or so. In other words, it's an absolute disaster to retake a qualification. Because, you know, Einstein said, you know, if you keep doing the same thing expecting different outcomes, you're mad. You need to do it in a different way. So I absolutely agree, it needs to be embedded. And if they need to take a GCSE later, maybe they'll have the confidence that Johnny was talking about and be able to take the GCSE subsequently. But they need a new way. We've got to teach them differently to the way that we were taught them at school.
This is such a key debate in our sector at the moment. I just wondered, is there anybody in the room who's got a different perspective? Yeah? Or would most people agree with that sense of what's being said? Yeah? Okay, so we'll move on. Wendy, please.
Bearing in mind some of the news we've heard over recent months about funding, is there a funding crisis in further education?
Do you want to direct that as
Yeah,
specific?
to Steve and Julian, really.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll kick off. Well, as a sixth form college, I would say absolutely. I don't think there's ever a time when there isn't a funding crisis, probably. But for me, the new formula and the new arrangements of funding have seen sixth form colleges be 6% net losers, so we lose 6%. If you add on top of that the 10% we lost in 2010 with the entitlement funding for enrichment and tutorial, that still gets my goat, to be perfectly honest. People will say we're offset with a bit of disadvantage, but then we've seen more recently, it sounds very woe is me this, doesn't it, but then we've seen recently reduction for 18-year-olds. We've also seen the huge increase in 16 to 19 free schools and the increase in academy sixth forms, who of course are exempt from paying VAT. So that's the kind of add-on. So yes, from my perspective, I think sixth form colleges have been the net losers. And of course, I can't, in my college, I can't cross-subsidise from better funding that the schools can in kind of key stage 3 and 4, and I can't access really any adult work or anything like that to an extent. So bluntly, yes, for me.
Yeah, I'll try and sound more positive. There is a real problem. I mean, if I take the college I work at, the challenge we've got next year is we're going to lose about £700,000 to £800,000 as a result of the change in the 18-year-olds. I know it's mitigated for year 1, but we're talking about the future. The ASB, the development schools budget, is down to £500,000 in our place. Not everybody knows that teachers' pensions, the employers' contributions, going up in September 2015. So the on costs for teachers will go up from 26% to 32%, because there's also a national insurance increase at the same time, September 2015. And then the local government pension scheme is almost certainly going to go up. So I've been in the sector since 1977. There probably is, you know, we're always saying there's a funding crisis, but this probably is going to be the most challenging time. However, I think we've demonstrated before that we do have a good track record of innovation. We're going to have to do some things very differently. I was at a meeting yesterday where the mood, I did feel, was very negative, and I think it's going to be unhelpful. We had that debate earlier about values against value, and I think what we need to do is remind ourselves what our moral compass is, and we also have the input about goals. You know, we've got to think about what we're going to do. We're going to have to do some things quite differently, but it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, particularly from September 2015 on. There's no doubt about that, but I think we can do that. You know, the sector's done so many things before, but we're going to have to rethink it.
So there is a funding crisis, but actually, how do we respond to it? Helen, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Like many people in the room, I've been in FE for many, many years and can recount the liturgy of funding crises, the ALF conversions, franchising, you name it. But I want to really get underneath why we're always living in times of funding crises and what is it that precipitates that. In my experience, the only two real levers for change in our sector, one is funding And because if they want you to do something, they'll fund it well. If they want you to stop doing it, they'll stop funding it. The other lever for change is the inspection with the same consequences. So my question is really, you know, why after 21 years can we not get to a sensible funding model that is actually transparent, is fair, and actually allows us to do what we need to do to achieve that moral compass point, if you like. And it goes back to what we were saying before about when do we say no? Well, we know what we need to do, and what's more, we know how to do it. Managing in FE has always been that, like standing on a wobble board. We look at funding crises, we make decisions. That impacts on the quality of the learner's experience. That then impacts on the quality of the outcomes. And guess what? That impacts on the financing. We go all over again. So there's no wonder we're fit and lean, because we're always on the wobble board.
Thank you. Some good responses there. Lady in the green over there, please.
It's Judy Lewis here from Colleges Wales. Can I ask the panel whether you consider that the standard actually in further education is actually falling?
Can you direct it to somebody?
So Helen start. The standards, are standards in further education falling?
Standards, it's a very broad term really, in terms of standards of outcomes, standards of the learner's experience, standard of teaching and learning. I think one of the things that the new inspection framework has done, which I applaud because I've been around inspection since it started, was it puts teaching, learning and assessment of the learner at the heart of the process. And if we get the process right, then I honestly do feel that the outcomes will be achieved as a result of good experience. But if we keep always looking back and saying, well, you know, our standards are worse than they were before, I think we're always going to be saying yes, because the bar is raising. And that's what it's all about. If Ofsted have not brought about a raising of the bar, then what have they been doing for all this time? So I don't think standards are falling, I think our expectations are increasing, and it's getting harder to achieve those expectations.
Okay, David, would like to come in?
I'm just going to put it in a wider context. A lot of the research we've been doing over the last few years has also been looking at the whole area of performance. Can we actually measure performance? And we make a lot of assumptions about whether we can measure performance, and most of them turn out to be unfounded. And interestingly, things like performance appraisals, which so many organisations, both public and private sector, spend a lot of time, a lot of money on, the trend now is for organisations that actually have researched whether they work, to throw them out. So Adobe, for example, has, just over a year ago, threw out performance appraisals. Instead it has developmental discussions with people. And it's trained people in the quality of those discussions. The outcome of that has been a massive improvement in employee engagement, but also 30% increase in the retention of people who might have, the most effective people in the organisation, and a 50% increase in the attrition rate of people who actually are the lowest performers, because people have been able to have the honest conversations with them. And I worry a great deal that when we impose systems to go and monitor people and try and decide you're a high performer and you're not, A, there's a lot of evidence that suggests there are all sorts of biases that come into that in general, but B, we may actually be getting in the way of the honest conversations that we need and getting in the way of the developmental conversations we have. And I'm looking at the moment at the University of Houston with some of their teachers or their program there, to look at how do we have honest conversations.
And wasn't it Jim Collins From Good to Great that said you can manage or monitor up to good, but for excellence and outstanding, you absolutely can't. It has to be, it's a different dimension, a different way of approaching it.
You have to basically get out of the way.
So we need you to come and research FE to actually look at that, because I think that narrative is confused. Our standards have consistently gone up in every which way, but actually the overarching narrative is that they haven't. So that's who would want to fund a research project for you to come and evidence that? It's true. Trevor, if you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of fortunate enough to get in quite a few colleges, and I don't believe standards have fallen at all. The results show quite clearly that they haven't. But I'm going to add to that what I do see is a lot of teachers stress, a lot of teachers overworking, a lot of teachers making a commitment to teaching that is over and above the actual teaching hours. They're working Sundays, they're putting it in because they still recognise it's a vocation, not a profession. It's very much about the learner. So I'm talking about those at the coalface. Have standards fallen? No. But we've got to remember that I think there's a limit now to how much further we can go. And I think we will plateau. I think we will get to the stage where standards will plateau. And we will possibly see a reduction in those standards. I want to say it now while I've got the opportunity. I think it is very much linked to what was said earlier on in the actual funding regime. And that is also linked to, you know, it's linked to what I call the lobby. One of my biggest frustrations, I've been in the sector 21 years, not as long as some of these illustrious people. I've been in it 21 years, and one of my biggest frustrations, and I'll sum it up, I was fortunate enough to be with a government minister a while ago, who's responsible for education, in a room, just the two of us. And basically he looked me in the eye, because I'm always lobbying. Everywhere I go, I'm lobbying for I love my sector, I lobby for it. And he said to me, Trevor, your sector's the one sector. He said, this is off the record, I'm sharing it with you. He said, your sector's the one sector that really doesn't have an effective lobby. He told me straight. He said, so we get in that cabinet room and we sit down and we've got to make cuts. Effie's top of the list. And it's my frustration because I believe it is at the core of being a principal that you lobby. It is at the core of what you do. We have to start saying no. You've got to come together and become a more cohesive body. And I know Lynne does all she can in that respect. But until you do, we are always going to be top of that list. And that was an off-the-record conversation. He said, Trevor, I like what you're saying, but he was literally laughing at me. You know, so we get your principles in a room and we just take them apart. So I think it's all linked. And our standards falling? No, they've risen. But I think we're going to plateau shortly.
There's some real food for thought there. Just to let you know, what I've said is about to experiment with developing a support programme for principals to actually lobby, to learn how to be effective lobbyers. Julian, you wanted to speak and then I'm going to go out to the floor. Yeah?
It just following up Trevor's point on lobbying, at the risk, I don't want to sound negative against him, but on lobbying, and again, forgive me for having a sixth form college hat on, there's 93 or 4 sixth form colleges. We account for less than 1%, I think, of the Education Funding Agency's budget. We've got an effective representative body in the Sixth Form Colleges Association, but the bottom line is for us, we're out of the mainstream. And therefore that lobbying, and I'm totally with Trevor on it, because I speak locally to my MPs, I will speak to anybody who will listen about the value and the efficiency and the high standards within the sixth form college sector. But I'm out of the mainstream. And that is an incredibly difficult place to be. And without opening the hornet's nest, there were a large number of sixth form college principals who were looking at academisation, not just for the VAT, far from it, but actually to get inside the tent.
Okay, these are really useful insights. And John, you just want to say a sentence?
I just want to say it's horrifying to me that funding for further education is hit first, because it's this juncture between what is school life, which is not the real world, it is junior world, and then this link to the real world is yourselves, and it's so essential. So really, this should be protected even more than just the normal education. So I'm horrified by that.
But it's very much a fact. So, more questions from the floor, please. Gentlemen over there. You've already asked a question, so I'm going to go over here first and then come back to you. Yeah?
John Waits from Panellists College. So, how do we get this on the front page of the Daily Mail then?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that, please?
How do we get this on the front page of the Daily Mail then?
Well, how do we on the front? Do we want to be on the front page of the Daily Mail? Yes, we do, and for good reasons. We don't want to be scandal. Yeah? Right, who would like to take that?
Well, I've got a batty idea, but it probably won't work. And that is that if a student comes to your college and is unable to study what they would like because there's not sufficient funding, I think we should give them a little postcard which tells them where the next surgery is for their MP. And I think we should, on the postcard, say that for every pound spent on post-19 education, the government gets £25. That doesn't count with what the student gets or what the company the student works for gets. It's £1 in, £25 out for the funding. And you can put that on the postcard as well, maybe a few other salient facts, and ask them to join the queue of all the other students who will be at the MP's surgery to start saying, what are you doing to my future?
Okay, very good. Anybody else from the panel? Anyone else like that?
Do you think that the cuts are, because of this situation, the cuts think, well, industry want you to function, and so industry can pay for it? Is that what they're doing, you think?
Yeah.
I think there's as long as the government's not paying for it, they're happy. I don't think there are very many people in the Department for Education or in the Department for Business and Innovation and Skills or MPs in either of the houses who've ever been in FE themselves. They're barely aware that it exists as a sector. It doesn't register on their radar. I don't think they understand it. It's a mystery to them.
But if I could just, I was with Vince Cable at a big conference last week before, and he did actually say, I mean, he loves FE, Willits and Hayes, all new FE through their parents, that in the political discourse, FE tends not to feature. And he was not saying it's your fault, FE. He was saying, despite your best efforts, despite everything you do, the nature of the discourse. So I think the whole notion of lobbying is important, but perhaps it has to be a different kind of lobbying because of our position. But I think let's leave that question hanging. I think it's a really good question, and perhaps we can find other ways, Paul, of answering that question, because I think it's a really critical one. Gentleman over here, his name I forgot.
Right, thank you, Robin. Is there a leadership crisis in our sector? It'll be slightly controversial here. Many of us over the past 20 years, certainly from my perspective, have championed trust in FE, reduced bureaucracy, and with that comes accountability. If you were outside looking in, there's not a week that goes by with a news story that breaks about mismanagement and declining standards if you were looking on the outside. And has there been a case over the last 10 years of creep with some CEOs managing their own perception rather than managing their colleges? Because it feels like we're taking a step backwards, and until we regain that trust, then the policymakers in government won't take us seriously.
Okay, so the question is there a crisis in FE? And I heard a second one, are CEOs managing their own
Perception rather than their colleges?
rather than their colleges? Who would like to go first? Trevor looks very keen here. And David.
At the risk of not making some enemies, yes. Simple answer to that question is yes. I've worked in a lot of colleges. There are some absolutely awesome principals and CEOs who are completely learner-driven, who really value the hard work that their staff do, and they're making an awesome contribution. However, I kind of do err with the colleague that there are some who are, it's very much about me, it's about how I'm perceived, it's about, I'm going to say it, OBEs, it's about goals, it's just about self. And I've seen an increase in this sort of approach. I think it also affects the ability of us to come together as an effective lobby. I don't really want to say much more on it because it's quite a controversial topic, but the answer is absolutely yes. That is what I've experienced, it's what I've seen. Some huge egos and a lot of me, and not a focus on what it's really about, which is the learner.
Okay, thank you. David wants to come in, and then Stephen.
I don't just think it's this sector, I think it's every sector. Wherever we look, we find that people are advancing through organisations who are the wrong people. They're not the most talented people. And I'll be talking about that in one of the workshops this afternoon, some of the evidence around that. But essentially what happens is that we've gone for the more that we have systems, HR systems, that actually allow people to tick the boxes, the more we make it easier for people with narcissistic tendencies, and even worse, people with sociopathic and psychopathic tendencies, to get to organisations because they're masters at manipulating the systems. And when you look at things like, dare I say, Royal Bank of Scotland, or some of these big, if you look at the characteristics of the leaders there, you have to say, what the hell was HR and what were people doing to allow these people anywhere near the executive suite? And every sector that you look at, we see the same pattern, that you get organisations destroyed or malfunctioning afterwards by people simply who are self-focused and destructive. And one of the big distinctions we find between real talent and fake talent is that both can be ambitious and want to progress. But the difference between real talent and fake talent is that the people who are real talent are ambitious for a cause. And the people who are fake talent are, by and large, ambitious for themselves. And until we start managing that situation, we will continue to see that in all sectors.
Can you be ambitious for both? Does it have to be an either or? I just wonder. I'm not defending it, but... And if you don't know the work of the Daedalus Trust on hubris, it's brilliant. Stephen, then Helen, and then we'll go back to the floor. Yeah?
As the only CEO, and with an OBE,
Yeah. I did say it's all the book's efforts, didn't I?
I think I've been set up here. I became a principal in 1996, and trust me, there was quite a few blonkers then. So it's not really that different. Honestly, it's not that different. What's different now is there's a lot more women coming forward, which wasn't the case then. There's more diverse when you look at principals. It's still predominantly white, still middle-aged, men largely, but it is changing. I think there is a bit of a crisis at the moment because it's quite a daunting time for people to be taking over. I mean, your comment about the tea bag right at the outset, this is probably going to be one of the most challenging times financially. And a lot of people who strive to be a principal because they believe in the educational stuff are quite nervous about the financial stuff. And, when we talked earlier about standards are definitely not going down. They've stayed good. And one thing Ofsted has done, this isn't an advert for Michael Wilshaw, but I think he was right to take away satisfactory, because, most of you don't aspire to be satisfactory, so why do we want to send our kids to colleges that were satisfactory for a bloody decade? I think he was right to bring in requires improvement. And I think the focus on teaching and learning that has come about as a result of what Ofsted have been doing has been really helpful to the sector. It's just that unfortunately they've got a few other things that they do that are fundamentally wrong. So I think that has been good, but I think there is going to be a shortage of people stepping up in the next couple of years because it's daunting. And I think they're going to need some support around how they're going to manage that process. And if the response to having less money is to squeeze teachers more or to cut their pay more, we're knackered. Yeah. I think I can tell you about our college. Last year we paid this February we paid 2.1%. The year before we paid 2.7%. I don't believe that the way to manage the financial challenges is to pay the lowest paid people or relatively low paid people crap money. It's not a problem if you're on a six-figure salary with all the austerity, because many of the major ticket items you buy, you're better off than you were before. The problem is for people on 30 grand, 27 grand, 35 grand, their living costs have gone up massively, and I think we've got a moral responsibility not just to dump more work on them and to look after them. We've got to find other, smarter solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Helen.
I was with a principal not so long ago who said that being a principal now is very much stepping into the realm of premiership management. Yes. That if you don't get short-term success, then you're not going to be there very long. And I think that's increased as we've gone towards the business enterprise model in FE, where managing the business, managing the finance has had a disproportionate impact on being successful. And as a result, and I've certainly witnessed a lot of people climbing the ladder, but just staying long enough to drop the grenade and leaving other people to sort out the fallout, and then they moved onwards and upwards to drop even bigger grenades. But I do think that we have, it's a very difficult circle to square, or square to circle, if you like, in terms of the balance of teaching and learning and the importance of teaching and learning now, and the framework that evaluates leadership and management in terms of how they do their job in the interest of the learners. But I worked with a principal, not for very long, might add, who said, you know, what do they want of me? You know, I'm not managing a social service here. I couldn't get that point, you know, because he felt he was managing a business. And my argument is, if you cannot manage a social service in a business-like way, which is what the job is, then I think, you know, we must stop principals thinking that they're running a business exclusively, and it's all about the bottom line.
Okay. All I want to say to that brilliant discussion is it's true in every sector. I just don't want it to be it's worse here than anywhere else, because I'm not sure, but I hope it isn't. George, you wanted to come in?
Just George Trow, principal at Doncaster College. Obviously, as a principal and a practicing principal, I want to just make a bit of a statement in there. And it's certainly not about defending some of the terrible behaviour and some of the risky strategies that some principals have adopted. However, we've also got to consider that those principals, in many, many cases, have been driven that way, they have been encouraged that way, and the levers that government are often placing on the sector are actually encouraging that type of activity. And I think that it takes a really brave decision for some college principals to resist, in some respects, that venture, that risky venture, and keep a real eye on their core business. It is a challenge to make sure you do that. Some have actually gone completely the other way, but actually some of those have been encouraged very heavily by government policy, particular ministers, and by other organisations. So I think we've got to be really cautious that some of that has been a driven strategy by this government and the previous government.
Yeah, so perhaps we can go on to it. But is it a truism that power corrupts? What about middle managers? I mean, aren't they the ones who have the most incredible tension in an organisation?
You can't come in on this. I mean, obviously, as I said earlier, forgive me if I sound like a crack record, I can only really speak about the sixth form college sector, not wider general further education, but there's certainly an absence, a leadership crisis, I think, in the sixth form college sector. And when I interview, in my college, we don't call people middle managers, we use the phrase middle leaders, which is very schooling, probably. So a manager to me is somebody who's making sure the textbooks are all right and the exam entries are September, August, whenever it is. I'm interested in leadership, I'm interested in coaching, mentoring, holding people to account, developing people, empowering staff and so on. So I kind of ban the word manager in that sense in my organisation, there's power to it. But if you look at the school sector, the investment in terms of leadership from the National College, whether you like the National College or you don't, you're getting a lot of investment there, a lot of young staff coming through who've kind of now got a bit of wool on their back and they are taking that next step. They are able to access lots of resources in terms of educational leadership. In the sixth form college sector, it's very, very few and far between. And when I'm recruiting staff, it's very interesting. There has been a marked difference. And I think I'm a cute enough interviewer to work out who's giving me the National College jargon and who isn't. But it's interesting that when I'm interviewing staff, and I've recently at assistant principal level, i.e. assistant head teacher in the mainstream schools, there's been a marked difference between staff who come from a sixth form college and staff who come from 11 to 18 schools who want to move into the sector. And I do think in terms of, going on to Trevor's point earlier about lobbying, there's a lobbying issue to be done around resourcing for leadership training in the college sector.
When I was Chief Executive Cell, the National School College had 120 million a year. Guess what Cell had? 8. Had 8 million. And we've generated another 8 million ourselves, which took a lot of time and energy. So it was an interesting, but nobody ever kind of knew that. So people's expectations were more like the school. It's like, just look at it, there's just no comparison in the resource. So that's not a whinge, that was a fact and a reality. Charlie, did you want to say anything? Just
all I thought of was the BBC all the way through, and the BBC have dealt with this. It's just been terrible. And it was terrible for me. I walked away when I had very popular programmes because in adult television they wouldn't listen to me. Tomorrow's World said, "Can you come to us?" 3 times. I said, "Can I write my own pieces?" They said, "No, you'll have a writer." And I said, "But I've just written 23 series of programmes, and now you want me to have a writer for a 3-minute piece?" And they said, "Well, it's the way we do it." And I said, "Well, that's why the programme's going downhill," and it went. But it's wholesale at the BBC. How could you get an organisation to do so many cookery programmes, so many garden programmes, so many absolutely ridiculous programmes, when there are so many talented, which is your point, so many talented people want to get on there and do revolutionary television. You just squashed out. It's very sad. So I'm sure it's the same in your industry. The terrible thing of putting a control freak in control is they become more freaky.
Okay, so if there are still no more questions, I am going to bring us to a close. Can you please thank the panel? I think they've been absolutely tremendous.